If you're buying hay right now, bales, bags, whatever form it comes in for your animals, I want you to think about what you paid for the last load. $20 a bale, $25? More depending on where you are and what time of year it is. Now I want you to think about what's growing in the corner of your pasture that you haven't mowed yet. The stuff along the fence line, the plants coming up around the barn that you keep meaning to deal with. Because there's a real chance that some of what you're looking at out there, the stuff you're calling weeds, is outperforming that hay, nutritionally, measurably, sometimes by a significant margin. And today I'm going to show you 5 specific plants, not obscure ones, not things you'd need to go looking for. 5 plants that grow wild on almost every farm in the US, and exactly what's in them that your animals need. This channel is called the Animal and Plant Lost Vault. We recover farming knowledge that got quietly set aside when commercial agriculture took over. The practical stuff, the plant knowledge, the feeding systems that worked for generations before anyone was selling you a product to replace them. If that's the kind of content you want more of, subscribe now because there's a lot more coming. Let's get into it. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when people buy commercial hay. Most of it has been cut early, dried fast, and stored for weeks or months before it ever reaches your barn. The protein content starts degrading the moment the plant gets cut. The minerals leach out during drying. By the time that bale is sitting in front of your animals, you're feeding them a shadow of what that plant was when it was standing upright in a field, alive and growing. Meanwhile, right outside your fence line, in the corners of your pasture, along your driveway, growing up through your garden beds, there is fresh, living, highly nutritious forage producing itself right now. For free. That most farmers are either walking past every day or actively trying to destroy. That's not an exaggeration. That's just what happens when you learn to read a pasture differently. And that's exactly what today is about. Weed number 1. Dandelion. Let's start with the one you definitely have. The one you've probably sprayed, pulled, or mowed down at least a few times already this season. The dandelion, I want you to hear this clearly. The dandelion is not a weed in any functional or nutritional sense. The only reason it ever got that label is because it grew somewhere a lawn was supposed to be, and someone decided that was inconvenient. Your animals have never agreed with that assessment, and once you see the numbers, you'll understand why. The leaf of a dandelion measured at peak growth, before it flowers and before it starts putting energy into seed production, contains somewhere between 18 and 22% crude protein on a dry weight basis. Now compare that to Timothy hay, which is one of the most commonly purchased hays for horses, goats and rabbits across North America. Timothy hay runs between 8 and 11% crude protein, depending on cut, time of year and how long it's been in storage, often toward the lower end of that range. That's not a small difference. That's roughly double the protein content, growing wild in your field, and most farmers are either mowing it or poisoning it. And protein is just where it starts. Dandelion leaves are high in calcium, important for bone density in growing animals and milk production in does and ewes. They're high in potassium. They contain meaningful levels of vitamin A, vitamin C, and iron. The root, which most people never think about as a feed source, contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber that supports digestive health in ruminants and non-ruminants alike. Who benefits most from dandelion? Goats love it. They'll strip a patch clean given the chance. Rabbits thrive on it, especially lactating does. Laying hens that have access to dandelion during peak spring growth show measurably better yolk color and often increase production. Horses will select it over grass when they have the option. Even pigs do well with it as a mineral supplement alongside their regular feed. Now here's where most farmers get this wrong, and it's a subtle mistake. They either ignore the dandelion entirely or they manage it at the wrong time. They mow it before it can establish, or they let it go completely and it bolts, gets tall, flowers, goes to seed, and the leaves become more bitter and noticeably less palatable. At that stage, animals will still eat it, but they'll prefer other things first. The window you want is the vegetative stage, before flowering. That's when the protein content is at its highest and the palatability is at its peak. If you've got dandelion growing in a section of your pasture, start treating it like a managed forage patch. Graze it in rotation. Let it recover between grazing periods. Don't let it go to seed if you're trying to keep the stand productive, but stop trying to eliminate it. You would be paying to plant something half as nutritious if you tried to source it from a seed catalog. Weed number 2, Lambsquarters. Now this next one is where most people get genuinely surprised, and where the skepticism usually kicks in. So stay with me here because this one deserves a full explanation. Lambsquarters. The tall, silvery green plant with the slightly powdery-looking leaves that comes up aggressively in garden edges, field margins, and any ground you've disturbed or tilled is a plant most farmers have a specific relationship with. That relationship is frustration. It grows fast, it grows dense, and it competes hard with whatever you are actually trying to cultivate. So people pull it, spray it, till it under, and they do that while paying for alfalfa. Here's the comparison. Alfalfa is the gold standard of high-protein hay. The premium product that costs more per bale and gets recommended for livestock in peak production, pregnant animals, heavy milkers, animals that need to put on condition fast. Alfalfa comes in at roughly 15 to 22% crude protein depending on cut and quality. Lambsquarters, harvested at the right stage, runs between 20 and 29% crude protein on a dry weight basis. Now I know how that sounds. I had the same reaction the first time I sat with those numbers. If Lambsquarters is this nutritious, why isn't everyone talking about it? And the honest answer is, some people are. It shows up in foraging literature, in small-scale livestock nutrition research, in the practices of farmers who never fully walked away from using what grows wild on their land. It just didn't make it into the mainstream feed conversation because there's no profit margin in a plant that grows for free. Nobody's going to run an ad campaign for something you didn't buy. The protein figures I mentioned, 20 to 29%, that's the range documented in nutritional analysis across different growth stages and growing conditions. Your specific stand might come in toward the lower end of that range. It will vary based on your soil, the season, and how mature the plant is when you harvest it. But even at the conservative end, you are looking at a plant that is nutritionally competitive with the most expensive hay on the market. Beyond protein, Lambsquarters is high in calcium. At certain growth stages, it actually exceeds alfalfa on calcium content, which matters enormously for dairy animals, for laying hens, and for animals in late pregnancy. It also contains meaningful iron, manganese, and B vitamins that are difficult to find in comparable concentrations in dried forages. Cattle do well on it. Goats and pigs will eat it readily. Poultry love it, especially the seeds, which are high in both protein and fat. If you've ever watched chickens work over a Lambsquarters plant, they don't leave much behind. Now, and this part matters, so pay attention here, Lambsquarters does contain oxalic acid. Oxalates. This is not a reason to avoid it. It is a reason to feed it correctly. Oxalates bind to calcium in the digestive system, which means if an animal is eating Lambsquarters as the majority of its diet, and only Lambsquarters, over time you could interfere with calcium absorption. This is the same concern that exists with spinach and beet greens, which are botanical relatives of the plant. The practical answer is simple. Lambsquarters should be part of a varied diet, not the whole diet. Which honestly is how good farming works regardless of what you're feeding. Diversity in the forage, diversity in the feed. No single plant, not alfalfa, not timothy, not clover, should be the only thing your animals eat. Feed it fresh when the plant is young. The optimal harvest window is when it's between 10 and 18 inches tall before it starts to flower, when the protein content is at its highest and the oxalate concentration is at its most manageable level. And don't wait until it's towering over your garden beds and going to seed before you decide to act on it. Let your animals help you manage it early. You'll spend less time weeding and less money feeding at the same time. Before we get into the next two plants, I want to give you a frame that makes this whole list more useful when you think about it as a group. If you look at the 5 plants we're covering today together, not individually, but as a system, what you actually have is a year-round forage calendar that your land is already running entirely on its own. Dandelion and Lambsquarters are your warm season protein workhorses. Clover, which we're getting to in a moment, runs from spring through fall and improves your soil while it feeds your animals. Plantain grows year-round in most US climates, pushing through even into late fall. And the last plant we'll cover today fills the specific gap in winter, when everything else goes dormant and your hay bill is at its highest. That is not 5 random lucky finds. That is a complete seasonal forage system, producing itself without any input from you. Now the next 2 plants are the ones that tend to surprise people the most. Not just because of what's in them nutritionally, but because of what they may be doing for your animals beyond basic feeding. Weed number 3. Broadleaf Plantain. This is the one that surprises people most because it is so ordinary looking, so easy to overlook. Broadleaf plantain, not the banana-type fruit, the low-growing rosette plant with the wide-ribbed leaves and the little upright seed spike, is almost certainly growing right now in the most compacted, most walked-on, most ignored corners of your farm, along the edge of your barn, down the center of your livestock lanes, in the gap between the fence post and the gate. Plantain finds hard ground that nothing else wants, and it sets itself up there quietly. To identify it, look for a rosette of broad, oval leaves growing flat or low to the ground. The most distinctive feature is the veining, 3 to 5 parallel veins running the full length of each leaf, very obvious when you hold one up to light. The narrower variety, Plantago lanceolata, has longer, more lance-shaped leaves but the same parallel veining. Both are nutritionally similar, and both are what we're talking about here. On straight nutrition, plantain leaves contain between 14 and 18% crude protein at the young leaf stage, comparable to a solid cutting of mixed grass hay. It is rich in zinc, which is critical for hoof health and coat quality, particularly relevant for cattle and horses. It contains meaningful levels of silica, which supports connective tissue. Calcium and vitamin K are both present in useful concentrations. But here is where plantain moves into a different category from the first two plants. It contains a compound called aucubin. It's an iridoid glycoside, and what that means practically is that in traditional farming practice, across many cultures and across centuries, plantain was fed specifically to animals carrying parasite burdens. That traditional use got dismissed for a long time as folk medicine. But in more recent years, researchers studying small ruminant nutrition, particularly people looking at sustainable parasite management in goats and sheep, have been taking a serious look at plantain as part of what's called nutraceutical forage, a plant that provides nutrition and may support health outcomes beyond basic feeding. I want to be straight with you about how I'm framing this, because this is the part where it's easy for a video to start sounding like it's selling something. I'm not telling you that plantain is a dewormer. What I'm telling you is that there are published studies from agricultural universities and small ruminant researchers looking specifically at plantain as part of integrated parasite management in sheep and goats. That research is ongoing. The results so far are interesting enough that people are continuing to fund it. That is not the same as a clinical recommendation, but it is also not nothing, and it is worth knowing about. What I'll say practically is this. If you give goats or sheep rotational access to a paddock with plantain in it, watch what they do. They will ass. Go to it. They will seek it out specifically, often before they touch the grass around it. Animals self-select for things their bodies are signaling them toward. Whether that's purely nutritional or something more, I'll leave that to the researchers to fully resolve. What I know is that giving your animals access to it costs you nothing on a farm where it's already growing. Don't replace your vet program with a plant. But don't clear-cut the plantain along your livestock lanes either. At this point, if you're finding yourself thinking about your own land differently, the corners, the fence lines, the patches you've been ignoring, that's exactly what this channel is about. Next week, we're going into the hedgerows, the overgrown margins that most farmers either clear-cut or leave completely alone. And we're going to look at what's living in there that your livestock would benefit from having access to. Things with mineral profiles that would cost you real money to replicate in supplement form. Subscribe and hit the bell right now. You don't want to miss that one. Weed number 4. Wild clover. Clover is the one case in this entire video where conventional agriculture actually got the story right. They just told it incompletely. Most farmers already know clover is good forage. Seed companies sell clover mixes. It shows up in pasture blend bags. There's nothing surprising about clover's general reputation as a quality feed plant. What doesn't get said enough is this, like for a significant number of farms across the US, wild clover, volunteer clover that established itself without ever being planted, is already present in the pasture. And if yours is one of those farms, you have something growing for free that other farmers are paying real money to establish. On protein, white clover, the low-growing type with the round trifoliate leaves and white flowers, comes in at roughly 20 to 25% crude protein at vegetative stage. Red clover, the taller upright type with the reddish-purple flowers, runs around 15 to 20%. Both figures are competitive with quality alfalfa. Both far exceed standard mixed grass hay. Beyond protein, clover is high in phosphorus and calcium. It contains magnesium. It is highly palatable. Most livestock will choose it over plain grass when given the option. And then there is something clover does that none of the other plants on this list does. It fixes nitrogen. Clover has a symbiotic relationship with specific soil bacteria that live in nodules on its roots. Those bacteria pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and make it available in the soil, which means a clover-rich pasture is actively improving its own fertility while it feeds your animals. It is doing two jobs at once, and neither of them cost you anything. Now, important, and I want to spend a real moment here, especially for cattle farmers. Clover bloat is a genuine risk that has to be respected. When cattle or sheep are turned onto a lush clover stand, particularly wet clover, early morning clover, or when animals are coming onto it on an empty stomach, the rapid fermentation of clover in the rumen can produce gas faster than the animal can expel it, frothy bloat, and in severe cases it can be fatal quickly. This is not a reason to keep your animals away from clover. It is a reason to manage access to it correctly. The practical guidelines are straightforward. Don't turn cattle onto a pure, lush clover stand on an empty stomach. Fill them on dry hay first. Graze clover as part of a mixed pasture where grass dilutes the clover content and slows the fermentation rate. Avoid turning animals into clover paddocks in the early morning when dew is still heavy on the plants. And learn to recognize the early signs of bloat, left side distension, obvious discomfort, labored breathing, so you can respond quickly if it happens. Horses and goats handle clover better than cattle as a general rule. Rabbits thrive on it in moderate amounts. Poultry will eat it, but it is not their primary preference. The farmers who run into serious trouble with clover are the ones who turn hungry cattle into a paddock of nothing but lush red clover and walk away. Managed correctly, and it doesn't require complicated management, clover is one of the most productive, most nutritionally valuable free forages you can have in a pasture. If you've got it growing wild, and most farms do, the task is not to plant more. The task is to manage what is already there intelligently. One more thing before we move to the last plant, and this applies to everything we have covered so far, not just clover. You do not need to redesign your whole feeding program this week. Start by walking your farm and identifying which of these 5 plants you actually have. Most farms will find at least 3 without looking hard. Pick one. Watch where your animals naturally move when they have access to that area. Let them show you palatability before you start factoring these plants into your feeding decisions. This works over time. It is not a switch you flip. The farmers who get the most out of what their land grows naturally are the ones who observe first and adjust gradually, not the ones who clear the hay budget overnight and hope for the best. Add access slowly. Watch your animals. Note what they choose and what they leave. That feedback loop will tell you more about what is working for your specific herd or flock than any protein chart will. Weed number 5. Chickweed. Every plant we have talked about so far grows in the warm months. Spring, summer, the shoulder seasons. That is when most people think about pasture management, about what their animals have access to, about what is growing and what to do with it. But there is a gap that every farm eventually runs into. November through March, sometimes October through April, depending on where you are. The pasture goes dormant, the hay bill goes up, the animals are bored, they are on dry feed, and you are hauling bales in cold weather wondering if you calculated your winter feed stores correctly. The last plant on this list grows specifically into that gap. Chickweed is a cool season annual, which means it does something almost none of the other plants we have talked about today can do. It grows when everything else has stopped. It germinates in autumn, grows through winter in mild climates, and peaks in early spring, right before warmer temperatures finish it off. In colder climates, it emerges with the first thaw and puts on growth fast. In warmer ones, it is an almost continuous winter presence, and it tends to grow in exactly the places where you will find it most useful. Garden beds, barn surrounds, protected south-facing field edges, anywhere that has a little shelter from the hardest freezes. To identify it, look for a low, spreading plant that forms dense mats rather than growing upright. The leaves are small, oval and bright green, almost succulent-looking in healthy stands. The stems have a distinctive single line of fine hairs running along one side. The flowers are tiny and white with 5 deeply notched petals that look like 10 petals at first glance. Once you see it once, you will recognize it everywhere. Nutritionally, chickweed is not quite at the protein heights of the other 4 plants we covered. It runs between 12 and 16% crude protein on a dry weight basis depending on growth stage and conditions. That puts it in the range of decent mixed grass hay, which again is what you are currently paying for. But where chickweed earns its place on this list is in the combination of what it offers and when it offers it. It is high in vitamin C, one of the higher plant sources your livestock can access as fresh forage. Vitamin C matters for immune function, for stress response, for tissue repair. In winter, when animals are dealing with cold stress, reduced activity, and a diet of dry stored feed, having a fresh green vitamin-rich plant available is genuinely useful. It is not a luxury at that point. It is filling a real gap. It is a meaningful source of iron and calcium, and it contains saponins, naturally occurring compounds that have a mild cleansing effect on the digestive system, which is part of why animals tend to seek it out after periods on dry feed. They are often drawn to it specifically in winter and early spring, and that behavior is telling you something. Who benefits most from chickweed? Poultry, without question. The common name is not an accident. Chickens have been eating it for as long as chickens have had access to it. Laying hens that have access to fresh chickweed in winter, even in small amounts, often show noticeably better yolk color, which is a visible indicator of vitamin A and carotenoid content in the diet. If you have ever noticed that your hen's eggs look different in winter compared to spring, the loss of fresh green forage is a significant part of why. Chickweed is one of the most practical ways to address that without buying supplements. Rabbits do very well on it. Pigs will eat it readily. Goats appreciate it, though it does not provide the bulk they need from a primary forage. For small animals or animals in confined spaces, chickweed is particularly valuable because of how densely it grows. A well-established mat produces a surprising amount of fresh biomass in a small footprint. Now here is the timing mistake most farmers make with chickweed, and it costs them every spring. When the soil warms up and you are getting the garden ready, chickweed is still in its final growth flush. The most abundant, most lush it will be all season. Most farmers till it under at that moment. They are eager to get beds turned and planted, and the chickweed is just in the way. The better approach is to harvest that final flush first. Cut it, bring it to your animals fresh, let the chickens and rabbits work through it. Give yourself 2 or 3 days to clear the beds by consumption rather than by tillage. Your animals get a high nutrition late winter feed boost, you get your beds back, and nothing goes to waste. It is a small shift in timing that costs you nothing except a little patience. And then when autumn comes around again, the chickweed will return. It always does, and you will be ready for it. Here is what I want you to actually do after you finish watching this. Go walk your land, not to spray anything, not to plan anything dramatic, just to look. Take the 5 plants we talked about today, Dandelion, Lambsquarters, Plantain, Clover, Chickweed, and see how many of them are already there. Most farms will have at least 3 without looking hard. A lot of farms will have all 5. And once you start seeing them as forage instead of problems, it is genuinely difficult to unsee it. This is not about eliminating your hay budget overnight. That is not a realistic outcome, and I am not going to pretend it is. Hay still has a role. Stored dry feed still has a role, especially in deep winter, and for animals with high production demands. What changes is the ratio. What changes is how much you are spending versus how much your land is already producing for you without being asked. There is a real, measurable middle ground between buying everything your animals eat and ignoring what is growing for free on your own property. That middle ground is where this channel lives. The plant literacy that used to be basic farming common sense. The feeding knowledge that got quietly set aside when it stopped being profitable for someone else to keep it in circulation. The practical systems that worked for generations before the product catalogue became the default answer to every farming question. That is what we are recovering here, video by video. If this changed how you are going to look at your farm this week, even just one corner of it, one fence line, one patch you have been ignoring, drop a comment below and tell me which of these 5 plants you already have growing. I am genuinely curious what is most common across different parts of the country, and I read every comment. Subscribe and hit the bell because next week we are going into the hedgerows and overgrown field margins, the places most farmers either clear-cut or leave alone entirely, and we are looking at what is living in there that could save you real money in mineral supplements. It is one of the most overlooked topics in small farm management, and we are going deep on it. Share this video with someone who is paying too much for hay and does not know there is another option growing 20 feet from their barn door. See you next week.